This is a fictionalized account inspired by local legend. There's a stop on my afternoon route that isn't on any map. I remember the exact corner because the sign is crooked and because the light there never seems to warm the road. Hyatt Road meets Township Line at a place where the fields open and the houses step back, as if the town itself takes a breath. In winter, fog sits low on that stretch like an old blanket pulled over the landscape. In summer, the same corner smells faintly of cut hay and something older, wood smoke maybe, or the slow, sweet tang of lost things. The first time he boarded, the heater was on and my breath still clouded the windshield. High school students climbed the steps in the usual disorganized way. Senior boys at the front laughing, juniors hovering by the rear exit with headphones and the same tired jokes they'd traded for a season. They scanned their cards, shoved their feet under the vinyl seats. I kept the route in my head. Route 14, 3 stops in the subdivision, then up past the old feed mill to the eastern side of town, drop-offs along county line, and finally the campus. I had driven that bus for 12 years. Names blurred in my memory, but patterns didn't. I knew who would sleep and who would nod off over homework, who would ask for a ride to the depot on weekends. I liked that steadiness. It felt like order. He walked up the aisle and took the back seat without asking. He was small for a high school-aged passenger, too small, as if he'd come from a different class of weather. He wore a coat that belonged to another decade, the kind with stitching I used to see in my father's photographs. His jeans had that soft, worn look of something mended twice. He didn't hand me a pass, didn't show his ID. He didn't look at anyone, and he didn't speak. When the bus pulled away from the curb, I noticed wet, narrow prints on the floor between the rear wheels. Not the usual muddy, scuffed tracks that rub off after a day, but small circles of damp that darkened the vinyl and then vanished as the heater pushed warm air along the aisle. The back seat where he sat seemed to swallow the heat. The gauge said the heater worked fine, but when I glanced at the mirror, my breath came out in a little white cloud. It was a small thing. It was a thing that made my hands tighten on the wheel. He never rode more than 2 or 3 stops. He would appear at the corner on some afternoons during late autumn and into the early freeze. And later, once it snowed, he came less often, but with a kind of insistence, showing up on nights when the sky had bled down to iron. I learned his pattern the way a man learns the creak of a house, without trying to. After the 3rd time, my curiosity was heavier than I expected. Curiosity, for me, reads like duty. I pulled the bus into the depot and left him in the back seat long enough to make sure the others had filed out. He never left his seat to speak to me. He never asked to be let off. He just stood when the bus emptied. No, he didn't stand. He slid from the seat and walked straight out the rear door like a man who had practiced the motion, and the wet prints marked the steps, gone by morning. Dolores Shaner noticed before anyone else did. Dolores had the kind of patience built from long lists and worn folders. She had been the transportation coordinator longer than I had driven. She could read a route by the smell of its bus. She didn't look surprised when I told her about the boy on Hyatt Road. There are, in small towns, truths people keep not because they are mysteries, but because they are habits. Dolores folded her hands on the desk and tapped her pen against the wood in a way that meant she wanted to make sure what she said would find a place in my head. "You're driving Route 14, right?" she asked. "Yes," I said. My voice felt stripped down, like someone had taken a photograph and repaired the edges. She opened a drawer and took out a slim, yellowed folder slid into a laminate sleeve. The plastic had been bleached at the edges. At the top, typed in a small official font, were words I did not expect to see on any memorandum. Route 14, Supplementary Protocol, revised 1987. It made no sense until she set it in front of me and the heat of the depot hit the back of my neck, and the smell of oil and old coffee filled the air. Dolores didn't smile. She slid the folder across as if it were a delicate object. "We keep these for drivers who run into complications," she said. Then she tapped the laminate like a woman establishing a boundary.
Read them. Twice. I read them. I read them slower than I'd ever read a road test form. The rules were numbered, simple, and at once absurdly particular and spare. They were printed in a typewriter font, the sort of thing you find on policy sheets from an era when forms were meant to be obeyed and not questioned. Route 14, Supplementary Protocol, revised 1987. 1. If the passenger boards, allow him to take the rearmost seat. Do not move him. 2. Do not ask his name or his origin. If he speaks, answer only in short, practical phrases. 3. Limit direct eye contact. Use the rearview mirror for checks. Do not hold his gaze longer than a heartbeat. 4. Never remark on the cold. If passengers mention it, divert conversation. Do not admit that the seat is colder than others. 5. Place a whole apple on the dashboard at the start of each route and again after the last stop, visible but untouched. 6. If he meets your eyes, say aloud, "I hope you find your way home." I read them twice before I said anything. The words might as well have been a map to an island no one wanted to visit, but everyone had circled. Dolores watched me as if I were a man who had just been handed a key and a warning. Some doors will be opened by turning it, but counsel is to avoid prying. "Do we know who wrote this?" I asked. She shrugged. "Old drivers. A couple of names on the back. Retired now."
It's been passed around. Folks think of it as a protocol. Some drivers laugh. Others, she pressed her lips together, others follow it. If the rules had been ridiculous, I might have laughed too. The apple seemed quaint, almost silly. But rules live in language because they expect to be obeyed. They were meant to translate something into habit, something that might otherwise be forgotten. On the way home that night, the apple sat on the dashboard in my rear view, small and bright against the gray. I told myself I was doing it because I liked small acts with meaning. I told myself it was the sort of ritual a driver makes to steady his hands. I started a notebook that week because the rules suggested I should. Not because the rules said to keep notes, but because I needed to explain to myself why I kept stopping at a corner with no students, and why it bothered me more than it should. I wrote in ink and kept the notebook on the seat beside me like a second passenger. The pages filled with the small details you notice when you make practice of watching. The tilt of his hat, the exact place he put his hands, the day the snow melted into a gray scrape in the gutters. There were other markers, an apple every morning, replaced weekly. Once, early on, I found that the apple had been moved slightly toward the center of the dash, as if some invisible hand had nudged it closer to where the windshield caught the road. I didn't think so. I didn't put my hands on it. I kept the ritual because rituals make the world legible. You learn to keep certain things to yourself in a job like this. Bus drivers are custodians of a thin domestic trust: keys, schedules, neighborhoods. We see the parts of people's days they do not always intend to show. We are given small confidences: a forgotten homework sheet shoved under a seat, a girl's hair tucked under her hood, the way a boy in the back grips his phone and holds it like a shield. I told myself the rules were simply a protocol for oddities: a person with no route, a rider who looked as if he belonged to another time. I told myself most practical things. But practical rules get weight when someone else insists on them. There were drivers who would not, by all accounts, speak of what they had seen at Hyatt Road. Drivers who would only say, "Follow the protocol and you'll be fine." There were others, older men with lopsided hats, who told stories about nights when the heater failed, about walks home that went wrong in the dark. They spoke of one child who had, once, not been found. Their mouths went dry when they said it. They didn't tell it as a story, more as a wound. When you live long enough in a small town, you develop a sense for the difference between story and memory. The two overlap, yes, but memory insists on certain facts: the date, the name, the weather. Stories bend those things to make a point. The rules insisted simplicity:
They did not tell a story. So I followed them to test what following would bring me. I began to notice patterns that felt less like superstition and more like a ledger of care. When the boy was present, the senior boys at the front suddenly found their own conversations quieter. Students who usually slammed the back door on the way out lingered to nudge the door shut like they were afraid a draft might follow. One afternoon, a chorus of laughter stopped mid-sentence when someone glanced back and saw the small figure hunched there. It felt as if kindness was contagious in the way a cold spreads, quiet and inevitable. There were technical anomalies, too. The heater would cycle in odd rhythms at exactly the stretch of road near Hyatt Road. I chalked that up to old wiring. But the first time the bus registered a dip of 6 degrees on the digital readout while the thermostat hummed, I felt something more complicated than mechanical failure. The surface of the windows fogged in the back in patterns like breath, not the thin film left by 1,000 teenage hands. I watched the fog bloom at the rear and wipe away at the driver's windshield as if it recognized a difference. I kept the apple. I set it on the dash at the start of every route. I told myself the apple was an offering, in the way people leave flowers at a roadside memorial. It sat whole and shiny until I replaced it a week later. Once, a student asked me why I had a fruit on the dash. He was 17 and bored and sarcastic, the way 17-year-olds warm toward life. He wanted to joke. He wanted me to be the butt of something. I told him it was a superstition, and he rolled his eyes and asked if apples were now a part of the school budget. It's for good luck, I said, because for respect felt like a confession I wasn't ready to make. Good for what? He asked, and I thought of all the small things that pass for prayer. A knot of hair tucked behind an ear, a last-minute homework page copied under a lamp, a phone charged before a long night. For finding your place, I told him, for staying warm. He laughed and clambered off at his stop. Later that week, I saw that same boy. Caleb, I learned his name when he finally told me, a kid with a shy smile, stand in the rain at the corner as if he meant to leave and then changed his mind. He ran for the bus as if late, hair soaked, and when he climbed aboard, he went straight to the back seat and sat with his head down. When the bus rolled away, his shoulders were visibly less hunched. Something small had changed. I told myself it was coincidence. Small things accumulated into a mosaic. A child's cough that stopped mid-fit. A sophomore who always wore earbuds, who removed them and whispered a thank you. The driver who came in to get his own lunch and left with eyes that had been damp. People do not always agree when confronted with the quiet uncanny. Some laugh and call it a trick of light. Other people pall at the memory and never speak again.
My notebooks filled with small instances, and my hands shook the first time I read a driver's retirement note in which he simply wrote, "For those nights at Township Line." By November, I had started to keep an extra copy of the laminated sheet in the glove compartment. I didn't show it to anyone. I carried it like a talisman you keep because you are unsure what else to do. The rules were not a story I wanted in conversation. They were a manual, a set of gestures you practiced until the gestures became part of muscle memory. If you asked me then whether I believed, true belief is a large word, I would have said I believed in the efficacy of small, consistent acts. That was the honest part. The first time the rules forced me to choose, it was over something small and lodged like a stone in the shoe. A girl I had driven since freshman year, Samantha, missed her pass one morning and tried to swipe a friend's card. I stopped her at the door because it's my job to keep the fare straight, and she bristled like a cat cornered. She muttered something about me policing students like a hall monitor. Her cheeks were red with cold. Another rider, someone who cut classes more often than not, said it was ridiculous and that the rules were silly. I remembered the instruction, "Do not remark on the cold." So I kept my mouth shut when Samantha complained about the heater. I watched the mirror like the rule suggested, refusing to hold her gaze longer than I should. It felt wrong. Little misalignments always feel wrong first. But at the last stop, when I replaced the apple as the rule instructed, I caught myself whispering into the hollow of the bus where only the heaters and vinyl seats listened, "I hope you find your way home." It fell from my lips not as a chant, but as a small, private hope, the kind that smells like bread, the kind that rests on the air and does nothing miraculous, and yet warms the throat. The words are ordinary until they are spoken in a particular moment, and then they anchor themselves. I did not know then that anyone had ever heard them back. People who have worked in transportation long enough are good at making a life of the small and the repetitive. We keep careful sheets, endless little tabs of who rode where and when. I began to notice names in older logs, names that spoke to the friction of memory. At the depot, in the back where old maps curled like dead leaves, someone had stapled copies of newspaper clippings in a thin scrapbook. The print was grainy, and the headlines were the kind that mark a town's private tragedies. One evening after my shift, I sat in the library, because that's what you do when you have a question you want to keep honest. You go to the place that keeps other people's questions in neat rows. The room smelled of dust and toner and the dry paper you only find in buildings that have lived through 2 generations. I asked at the desk for the microfilm reels. The clerk had the patient look of someone who sees small obsessions come and go like seasons. She showed me a reel marked Local News, 1964, and another labeled Obituaries and Weather, 1964-65. Enthusiasm in a public library is cheap. Access, however, is methodical. Microfilm is a strange medium for the living. It reduces human life to the scale of grain and light. You turn the crank and a decade folds into a minute. I fed the reel into the machine with hands that weren't steady and watched the screen present columns of a town long before my time. Names lined up like headstones. I wasn't entirely prepared for the headline. Boy dies of exposure near Township Line. Thomas Edward Weller, 1964. The headline was blunt, no flourish. Hypothermia, the copy said, had overtaken a 12-year-old who had missed his bus and walked home in the early hours. The language was a measured thing. Coroner's report, searchers found, temperatures plummeted. The dates and the place matched the corner I knew. My hands left a print on the glass, and it was small and wet from the breath I had not noticed I was holding. There were photographs, grainy and gray, a house with shutters closed, a pile of coats in a parlor, neighbors pulling on boots. There were quotes from townspeople, names I did not know, and one line that stuck because it was careful and unadorned. He was a child found alone on a winter road. The boy's parents were listed. The paper ran a later short piece about a memorial service and a small stone placed at a crossroads. Someone, perhaps a neighbor or a friend, had left a toy by it. I sat in the fluorescent hum of the library with the machine's light on my face and felt the hair at the back of my neck come alive. There is a particular quality to reading an old newspaper that is different than hearing a story repeated. The newspaper asserts the fact of the event without the color of a storyteller's voice. It says, "We noted this, we recorded it." In the weeks that followed, my notebook swelled. I made photocopies of the articles and tucked them between pages alongside my notes about apples and cold seats. The printed words, Thomas Edward Weller, felt too formal for the boy who boarded my bus, which is why I began to call him Tommy in my head. Names soften people. Names make ghosts into neighbors. The pattern, as you find when you dig into small-town archives, is not always elegant. It is a series of echoes. A clipping here about a child's unexplained comfort in a time of fright. A letter to the editor there thanking a nameless bus driver for concern. A police blotter entry referencing a mysterious youth seen walking a distraught teen home in the 1970s. The microfilm showed a scatter of mentions across decades, each a small record of someone spared from a night that could have been worse. They never shared the same breathless tone the tabloids like. They were quiet notes. A child helped, a lost student guided, an infant found sleeping by a field with no harm done. The name Tommy, in various iterations, showed up like a kind of refrain. It is easy to make a ledger of miracles when you forget the cost that produced the pattern. Records don't show the nights someone didn't come home and how a town sobered itself afterward. They are better at pointing to things than at explaining why. I read and reread the 1964 pieces with the slow attention of someone hunting for a seam. When I went back to the depot and set the laminated sheet against the steering wheel, the rules looked less like quaint municipal pageantry and more like a set of instructions laid down by hands that had learned to make grief tolerable. There are, of course, practical ways to respond to grief. You hold a ceremony, you put a plaque on a bus stop, you name a corner. You do the things that stitch loss into a place so that children who come later know they stand on ground that remembers. I had not yet imagined a plaque. I had not yet imagined a campaign. What I had was a feeling that the ledger, the arc of small rescues recorded over 30 years, meant something that existed outside of me. I also had a sense, not quite a conviction, that whatever the boy at the back of my bus was, he was tied to that ledger. When you keep a secret long enough, secrecy changes shape. It no longer feels like concealment. It feels like preservation. I kept quiet because the rules asked me to, and because the rules had a dignity to them I could not name. Saying nothing becomes a way of not making the world smaller. But silence is its own labor, and sooner or later that labor asks for recompense. One night, after a route that tasted like exhaust and stale coffee, a retired driver named Frank came by the depot. Frank smelled of pipe tobacco and the sort of weathered patience the town keeps around it like a warm blanket. He had a ledger himself, a stack of driver cards tied with twine. He stopped at the bus where I sat and leaned on the metal step like a man who had carried the world in his shoulder a long time. "You keep seeing him," he said without preamble. I looked at him. He had read the signs the way a seasoned mariner reads a harbor light. I could have lied. Lies are soft. But lying erodes a man in odd ways, and Frank deserved better than an untrue answer. "Yes," I said, "I see him on Route 14. He nodded, as if to say the admission had been expected for years. He fished something from his coat, an old photograph in a pocket that smelled of cedar, and handed it to me. The photo was black and white. A small boy sat on a porch step with a hat too large for his head. On the back, someone had written, in a shaky hand, "Thomas E. Weller, 1952. I put the photo in my wallet, like a prayer card. Frank didn't tell me anything new. He didn't need to. He only said what others had said in fragments. Follow the protocol. Do the small things. Don't make spectacle of grief. He mentioned an apple, too, but when he spoke of it, his voice softened, and for the first time I heard that the apple had been used as a kind of offering. Don't treat it like a superstition," he said. "Treat it like a memory. Respect it." I began, then, to treat it like both. I did not want to be silly. I did not want to be afraid. I wanted to be careful. They are different things. Care makes room for kindness. Fear makes room for avoidance. At the end of the month, I found myself standing at the corner where the fields fold back into town just as dusk bled into the hedges. The wind cut the road into a hard sound. I had an apple in my pocket. I had the laminated rules in my glove compartment. I had a stack of photocopied clippings in a manila envelope. I had no plan more complicated than to stand and watch. He came like he had come before, quiet and precise. He took the back seat and settled into space like a man who belonged to the bus and to no other. His coat looked more worn in that light. His breath left the air in a slow, patient fog. I pulled the apple from my pocket and set it on the dash as I had a dozen times since Dolores had handed me the folder. My fingers lingered on the cool skin. The habit was now a small ritual threaded into the routine of an evening drive. For reasons I couldn't name, I said aloud as I always did, not a prayer and not a promise, but an offering that felt like one. "I hope you find your way home." His head turned. He looked in my direction for, perhaps, a heartbeat by the rule's measure. I held my breath without realizing it.
He closed his eyes and then, without a word, rose and walked out into the evening. The wet prints marked the steps and then were gone by the next day. I drove home that night with the lamplight catching on the apple, and thought about what it meant to keep a small thing intact. The rules did not give me answers. They gave me a mallet and blocks of routine to tap together until something like meaning emerged. I did not know whether what we were doing was protection or remembrance, whether the apple was an anchor or a favor. I only knew that in the ledger of small mercies we had produced a pattern, and that patterns, when they persist, demand a reckoning. That reckoning, I could feel, was gathering at the edges of my life like storm. I had tugged at a thread and found the fabric was old and thick and stitched through with many hands. There were names to run down, clippings to copy, people to ask, Dolores, Frank, retired drivers who had stories that sat heavy under their tongues. There were other drivers who had protocols hidden in glove compartments and who would not speak openly about why. There was a boy who rode the rear seat, and the slow, patient accumulation of small rescues across decades.
I thought of how badly towns mend what is lost. With stones, with ceremonies, with plaques, and small gatherings where a community breathes together. I thought of the possibility that the ledger I was compiling might mean nothing at all to some and everything to others. There were practical steps to take. More research, perhaps a meeting with the superintendent, testimony from drivers who would come forward if they felt safe. There was also, in my chest, a small, stubborn sense that anger and sorrow had to be turned into something like honor. I went home that night and did not sleep well. The images from the microfilm, Thomas Edward Weller's name, the clipped photograph, the stark sentence, kept unspooling. I made a list on a yellow pad. Interview Dolores, photocopy clippings, find Frank's ledger, ask retired drivers for letters, talk to the school board about Route 14. The list calmed me in the way a map calms someone about to cross a field. When morning came, frost gilded the edge of the windshield. I scraped it away with the dull plastic scraper and slid the laminated sheet into the holder on the dashboard. The apple sat there like a single bright promise. The bus smelled of warm vinyl and coffee. The students boarded like the tides. The day unfolded as days do, slow, trained motion punctuated by small human combustions of anger and kindness. At lunch, I tucked my yellow pad into the pocket of my jacket and told myself I would not let this become a story of fear. And yet, the ledger was calling. There was a hesitance, a moral question I felt but couldn't name. When does remembering become enough? When does remembering become a replacement for doing something more? There were practicalities, there were people. There was a route that needed tending, and a boy who continued to appear in the back seat when he chose to. There was a town that had long ago decided to put certain griefs into quiet pockets. I was not sure if I wanted to pull at the stitches or to protect the seam. The microfilm had given me the fact of a life lost. Thomas Edward Weller, 1964, hypothermia. The laminated rules had given me a practice. The two together hinted at a duty. That day, as late afternoon sloughed into evening and the bus emptied and the heater coughed once like a tired animal, I rolled up my sleeve, took the yellow pad from my pocket, and wrote one sentence in block letters across the top. Find out who else remembers. It was as good a plan as any, and as modest as decent grief allows. I did not know then the resistance I would meet, the mixture of relief and anger that comes when a town is asked to look closely at a ghost it has learned to live with. I did not know the ways memory asks for a body. Plaques, petitions, names read aloud. I only knew that the rules had placed on me a kind of caretaking I could no longer reduce to superstition. He sat in the back seat when the bus stopped near Hyatt Road that evening. I adjusted the mirror and caught myself obeying Rule 3. I did not hold his gaze. I watched the apple on the dash and felt the small heat of the town's past against my palm. I had, in my glove compartment, photocopies of a headline and a tiny photograph. I had a list of names to call and a depot full of men and women who had, in their own time, learned to fold their grief into discrete actions.
The next morning, I called Dolores and asked if she had time to talk. She met me at the depot with a thermos of coffee and the look of a woman who had spent years arranging plates at a community table. She sat and listened as I confessed the ledger and the microfilm and the list on my yellow pad. When I finished, she rested her hand on mine and said simply, "You won't be the first to ask." I thought of the librarian, the way the light on the microfilm machine made the past look like a grain you could sift. I thought of Frank and the photograph that lived now in the back of my wallet. I thought of the apple and how ordinary its skin was to the touch. When I left the depot that day, the bus felt heavier in a way that almost felt right. There was a purpose now that wasn't merely to deliver students. There was a worry, too, the kind that rubs in the corners like thumbhole on a well-used book. That evening, after the last student had stepped off and the town had settled into its night rhythm, I drove to the corner and left the engine on for a while. The temperature dipped, the fog gathered. I set the apple on the dashboard and looked at the laminated rules as if they were a map to a place I had not yet learned to reach. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked and a radio played something old. I thought of how memory wants to be invited into the light if it's to stop hurting people, and how sometimes an invitation is made of the smallest things. A piece of fruit, a phrase spoken aloud, a name remembered. I did not know yet what form the invitation would take in public, an unveiling, a petition, a plaque, but I knew with a certainty that surprised me that I would not be satisfied with private rituals alone. The ledger of small rescues across the decades demanded a public act, or at least a public question. For now, I put the laminated sheet back into its sleeve and tucked it into the glove compartment, where the light would not reach it. As I drove my route the next day, the wind found the bus's seams and pushed itself under the doors. In the rear view, I saw him for a moment, a small shape that blurred like a memory. I held the wheel and spoke the phrase again in the private geography of the cab. The words were not magical, and I would not call them that. They were a neighborly benediction that a town had whispered across decades. "I hope you find your way home." When I said it, this time, something in the back seat, that small, quiet presence, shifted as if in acknowledgement. It was not a flourish. It wasn't a conclusion. It was a nod and a long conversation that had been going on without me and which I had only begun to join. I drove on, the apple glinting like a small sun. The route continued. The ledger waited. The next step was clear. I would dig. I would ask. I would gather what people remembered and hold it up like a small stone to see the reflection of the town in it. I would begin, in short, to make a record. If you like deep-dive local legends and the small truths they hide, tap subscribe so you don't miss the rest. Once I set my mind to collecting what others remembered, the work took on the slowness of a good chore, the kind that suits a winter afternoon. Methodical, hands busy enough so the mind has room to think. I started with phone calls and old habits. There are certain people every town keeps on hand for this sort of thing. The woman at the county clerk's office who knows where records hide. A pair of retired mechanics who remember the buses by their engines. A man who runs the historical society and treats every scrap of paper like it's miraculous until proven otherwise. I made appointments. I wrote names on my yellow pad. I made coffee for myself at the depot like a man preparing for an interview. Dolores was my first ally. She typed out a list of retired drivers she thought might talk. Frank, whom I had already met, an Evelyn who still wrote letters in fountain pen, a man named Eugene Pettit, whose name kept appearing on the older clippings as a driver from the 1960s. Eugene lived near the tracks, she told me, the depot clock clicking over our heads. He'd tell you anything at 2 a.m. if he had a drink in him. If anyone knows the old route changes and the strange stops, it'll be him. Eugene's daughter answered the door to a farmhouse that smelled of lemon oil and yesterday's newspapers. She kept the kitchen warm and her father's hat in a corner. Eugene had been 83. He had lost the steady bulk that once anchored him, but when he spoke, his words sat like small stones, deliberate and true. "You drove in the 70s, right?" I asked. He took a long breath and said, "I drove longer than that. I remember the night. No, I remember pieces." He had a photograph folded in his hand. He showed me a bus, long and metal and fatter at the nose than the ones I drove. In the margin, someone had written a note, "Township line stop, kept at bay by drivers." "We didn't talk about much back then," Eugene said. "We did the small things. Apples, a phrase. You understand about rituals when you lose someone. You try to do something steady with your hands." When I asked if he had ever left anything written, he shuffled a small envelope and produced a single sheet in a cramped, spidery hand. It wasn't official, just Eugene's memory made neat. Nights, dates he couldn't entirely recall, the name Tommy in the margins.
He remembered, he said, the stone by the road where neighbors had left flowers. He remembered the cold that took a boy in '64, and the way the town learned to wrap some of its grief in habit. "You keep a thing alive by naming it," Eugene said, "or you put a sign up so you're reminded to name it aloud." Those interviews gave me more than recollections. They gave me courage. People who had kept their silence for years stepped forward slowly when I asked them, partly because Dolores vouched for me, and partly because most of them had been carrying pieces of this ledger and wanted finally to set them in the light. Evelyn wrote me a letter on lined paper in brown ink. "There was a night my brother lost his keys," she wrote. "He swore he was guided home. I always thought it was a kindness. I will sign." Not everyone welcomed the idea. There were folks who saw the ritual as private and feared the town would turn it into spectacle. There were others who crossed their arms and told me ghosts are for stories and not for petitions. A barista at the corner diner told me, half joking, that if we put up a sign, kids would spray paint it in a week. A council member muttered that a memorial might encourage superstition. I listened, because listening was part of this, part of collecting every shard of argument so the thing we built would include, not erase, the town's contradictions. Caleb Dunlap, whom everyone now called by the name he answered to in high school, was the turning point. He wasn't the youngest witness. By the time I first met him, he was a junior and half grown into himself, but the memory of being small and frightened hadn't left him. He told me, plainly and without theatrics, about a winter afternoon years earlier when two older boys cornered him behind the school's auditorium. They were Derek and Dustin Yodar, twins with the kind of smug cruelty that learns its muscles early. They pushed him around and laughed, trying to take his backpack. He never used the word bullying in the broad way. He described the concrete things: shoved, phone dropped, two small wrists pinned, and a face wet with cold and shame. "I thought I was done for," Caleb said, hands wrapped around a paper cup, breath fogging in the evening air. "I couldn't get my voice out. I was thinking about the walk home and how long the road would be at that hour." He looked at me then and said the part that changed everything. "Then someone put his hand on my shoulder. I couldn't see who. It felt like someone took my chest and unknotted it. I wasn't crying anymore. I wasn't even thinking about running. I just felt warm, like I could breathe. I turned, and there was nobody." Caleb's face broke where memory and gratitude met. He came to the depot to sign the petition and to speak at the board if I could make space. "I remember the apple on the dash," he told the school board later, voice steady. "It sat there like it mattered." He did not seek glory. He sought the words that had steadied him. He wanted others to know how small acts had kept him upright. There were skeptics at the board, some who thought my petition amounted to a superstition dressed in civic clothing, others who worried about the administrative precedent of renaming a route or placing a memorial. Dr. Patricia Holloway, the superintendent, surprised me. She listened with an expression I recognized, not the blank of someone who attends every meeting, but the focused attention of someone who had spent time in hospital corridors and seen people look for anchors. She asked practical questions about costs, precedent, possible vandalism, and then she asked the one question that convinced me she had understood. Is this meant to be religious, or is it a community act of memory? It's a remembering, I said. It's honoring a name that keeps appearing in our records. It asks the town to look at what we've learned to do in private and consider doing it in public. She nodded. We can work with that, she said. We can frame it as civic memorial, not as a supernatural endorsement. Framing matters. Words change the light. We wrote the petition carefully,
a simple request to rename the Route 14 corner at Hyatt Road to Tommy's Corner and to install a plaque at the bus depot recognizing Thomas Edward Weller and the drivers, past and present, who kept the protocols. We gathered signatures not by aggressive canvassing, but by asking, at church suppers, at the grocery, at the library where the clerk had first let me look at microfilm until closing. Dolores printed copies of the laminated sheet and let drivers add their initials. People signed because they remembered nights. They signed because they recognized in the ledger the late, good work that keeps kids safe. Others signed because they respected the thoughtfulness of a town that knew how to mourn. The Yodar twins, Derek and Dustin, reacted angrily when I told them we aimed to make the memory public. They were children the town had known to be rotten in a way that frightened half the parents, and they did not like being cast as a cautionary subplot in other people's histories. They met with me in a parking lot once, a pair in hoodies, trying hard to look like they rolled out of bed with their contempt intact. "You're making ghosts into reality," Derek said, more sharp than threatening. "You made Caleb scared," I said. "He was a kid. He deserved better than that." Their reply was a shrug and some wordplay about superstition. They weren't violent, they were defensive, which is its own kind of cruelty. I don't say all that to make them villains in the way a novelist might. People are complicated. But in the middle of my campaign, they were a reminder that not everyone will welcome a town's reckoning with its past. Some will see remembrance as accusation. Others will see it as attempt to rewrite. What kept me honest through the campaign was the smallness of the ledger. Signatures, photocopies, a string of retired drivers' notes. We compiled driver testimonies in a binder and handed it to the board along with the petition. Frank came in and read aloud a short note he had written on envelope paper. "To remember is to repair by naming." Dolores had tracked down Catherine Weller Hoffman, Tommy's niece, who had moved away but kept the family name in her mouth like a hymn. Catherine sat in the boardroom with her hands clasped, an older woman who had not found reasons to speak often. She read a simple letter that made everyone fall quiet. She forgave the town for how it had let the winter take Thomas, and she thanked drivers for keeping his name in small gestures. We met resistance. The board asked for a public comment period. The comment period stretched like a seam. People came with questions and fears, and some came with memory like a lantern. An old woman spoke of leaving a toy at a crossroads in the 60s, and of how it mattered to her that someone else remember that someone once walked home and did not arrive. A high school teacher asked if our plaque might encourage students to perform stunts. A father worried about the precedent of memorializing things that have no tangible evidence. We answered each concern not with flame, but with information. The microfilm clippings, the older driver's notes, the notarized copies of retirement papers that mentioned Township Line. At one public meeting, the Yodar twins stood and made a spectacle, loud enough to test my patience. But they also revealed something in the way they spoke. Shame wrapped in bravado. That night, I thought about the way secrecy can protect but also calcify. The town had been keeping a secret, and in keeping it, we had allowed a handful of bad behaviors to persist in their shadow. Naming the corner was not meant to indict individuals so much as to invite a different communal posture, one that said loss matters, and we will attempt to remember correctly. After weeks of testimony and some procedural delays, the board voted. I sat in the back with Dolores and Frank and others who had given me courage. The clerk read the motion aloud, that the corner be officially named Tommy's Corner, and that a plaque be installed at the Route 14 depot in honor of Thomas Edward Weller and the drivers past and present who kept the protocols of Route 14. The vote was not unanimous. There were some abstentions, but it passed. I remember the relief as a kind of quiet rain. We had not turned a practice into a promise of miracles. We had created a place to remember what the town had done in private. We had made a small public act out of a ledger of small mercies.
The planning for the dedication ceremony had the modest, patient ambition of the town itself. Dr. Holloway agreed to speak. Dolores organized a potluck. The Catherine Weller Hoffman arranged for a small contingent of family to come down from the next county. The high school's marching band, small but earnest, would play a traditional hymn. Local reporters wrote pieces that were careful and kind. We asked the board to approve a simple plaque text. After rounds of edits, we settled on language that felt humble and true. The plaque would read, on its bronze face, something like this: "In memory of Thomas Edward Weller, 1952-1964. For the drivers and community who, across decades, tended small mercies in the night. May remembrance steady our steps." Placing bronze on stone felt like naming a thing in a way it had never been named before. I carved the apple before the ceremony. That may sound foolish, an apple for a plaque, but ritual had its place in what we were doing. I wanted one small thing that connected the private habits to the public acknowledgement. I sat at my kitchen table and took a pocket knife, and, more carefully than I had any right to be, I carved 3 words into the apple's skin: "I hope home." The flesh browned instantly where the blade had touched it. It wasn't meant to last. It was meant to be a small witness, a bridge between the dashboard and the plaque. When I wrapped it in cloth for the morning, Doyle, Dolores' spaniel, sniffed and gave a low, approving snort. The day of the dedication was cold, bright. A pale sun hung over the field where people gathered. Breath clouded the air like a chorus. We set folding chairs in rows. The bus depot smelled of oil and coffee and the faint sweetness of apples. The students from the high school came quietly, all of them with phones in pockets, some with eyes that looked new at the idea of a town insisting on memory. Dr. Holloway spoke first. She did not dramatize. She reminded us of the legal and civic processes we'd navigated. Then she took a breath, and in the softest part of her voice, she read aloud the ledger, some of our clippings, some of our drivers' testimonies, and then she said, simply, "We remember because memory holds us together. This marker is for the small acts of care that kept our children safe." There was a hush as she stepped down. Dolores walked to the plaque with a small step and the kind of dignity that belongs to women who have kept things running for a long time. Catherine Weller Hoffman, who had flown in, placed a hand against the cold bronze. She did not cry loudly. She wept in a way that made everyone else still. When it was time to unveil, the cloth came off and the bronze glinted in a small, honest way. People clapped politely, some with cheeks wet. The camera flashes were small and polite too. That was when I saw him. Tommy stood at the edge of the crowd like he'd been waiting his whole life for the chance to see how the town would name him. He was as he had always been in my memory, small, wearing a coat that looked like an heirloom, breath forming thin silver in the air. He didn't look like a ghost because he looked like the town's memory made flesh, neither elaborate nor frightening. He kept a small distance, as if respect forbade him stepping too close. People looked away out of shock and then relief. Some had to swallow to make their breath regular again. I felt all the rules in my ribs: the apple on the dash, the mirror glance limit, the phrase taught in a laminated folder. I found myself moving toward the plaque with the cloth-wrapped apple in my hand. It felt absurd and fitting both. I placed the cloth on the base of the plaque. I was aware, suddenly, of the stupid human urge to say the thing that had been our private benediction for years. Standing there, in front of a town that had argued and agreed and bent its routine toward this moment, I spoke the words. "I hope you find your way home." It was the phrase exactly as it had been printed on the laminated sheet, and the one that every driver had learned to say without fanfare. The words did not open the sky or produce a display. They did something quieter. Tommy's face changed, just a little, a motion like a tide retreating. Then he looked up and gave a small smile. Not the smile of triumph, not a show, but the way of someone finally able to breathe in a room that had been reading his story aloud. For a second, time narrowed to a human scale. A dozen heads turned,
A woman dabbed at her eye. A teenager took a picture, and then, for a reason I couldn't name, put his phone away. Catherine wiped her hands and touched the plaque. Dolores reached out as if to steady the cloth still on the base. The apple I had carved, its knife marks browned and honest, sat under the plaque's ledge like an offering. Someone later would call it an act of folk piety. I only knew I had wanted to put something from my hands where we had decided to put a name. Tommy didn't speak. He couldn't be forced into narrative. But after a small while, he moved, not toward us, but a little away, toward the corner where the fields opened. He looked back once, and in that look there was gratitude and a kind of permission. Then he walked off, the way someone leaves a stage once the curtain has been drawn back. The wet prints he left on the depot steps were invisible in the afternoon light. People clustered afterward, trading small, quiet versions of the story. How the apple had been there on a January morning, how a student had been comforted, how a bus driver had said a phrase and the shaking of a child's hands had stopped. The Yodar twins didn't show. They had left town for work that week, as rumor later had it. Perhaps they couldn't face the quietness of admission. Some will always prefer the heavier shape of denial. That is part of what a town must bury with patience. The plaque stayed. The board arranged for a small maintenance fund. Dr. Holloway arranged for a modest ceremony every year. People brought new apples for a while, leaving them on the plaque's little ledge like votive tokens. Someone later would call it an act of folk piety. I only knew I had wanted to put something from my hands where we had decided to put a name. Tommy didn't speak. He couldn't be forced into narrative. But after a small while, he moved, not toward us, but a little away, toward the corner where the fields opened. He looked back once, and in that look there was gratitude and a kind of permission. Then he walked off, the way someone leaves a stage once the curtain has been drawn back. The wet prints he left on the depot steps were invisible in the afternoon light. People clustered afterward, trading small, quiet versions of the story. How the apple had been there on a January morning, how a student had been comforted, how a bus driver had said a phrase and the shaking of a child's hands had stopped. The Yodar twins didn't show. They had left town for work that week, as rumor later had it. Perhaps they couldn't face the quietness of admission. Some will always prefer the heavier shape of denial. That is part of what a town must bury with patience. The plaque stayed. The board arranged for a small maintenance fund. Dr. Holloway arranged for a modest ceremony every year. People brought new apples for a while, leaving them on the plaque's little ledge like votive tokens.
The apples browned, the town's weather bleached their skins, and the practice settled into a rhythm of remembrance rather than performance. Some drivers added a small note to their glove boxes. Others held the laminated sheet against the steering wheel on nights that felt like old storms. We had made private practice public, and the public breathed a different air because of it. There were quieter epilogues. Caleb came back that week to speak with some of the freshmen about what had happened. He didn't speak of ghosts then, only about the small gestures of something that steadied him. A phrase, a warm seat, someone who noticed. He'd become a part of the thing he'd been saved from, a young man who now recognized the debt he owed. He volunteered at the shelter in town and helped younger students feel safer on dark walks home. I watched him one afternoon at the bus stop and felt that the ledger had spilled outward into real lives. Catherine Hoffman, Tommy's niece, stayed only a few days. Before she left, she came by the depot with a small box of things. An old hat, a pair of mittens no one had realized had been kept, a program from a memorial service in 1965. She pressed my hand and said, "You gave his life weight again, thank you." Her gratitude was a physical thing, a hand on my palm, and for once I didn't stammer. The rules remained in our hands and our glove compartments. Drivers still placed apples on their dashes. We still limited eye contact. We still spoke the phrase when a small shape came into the rear of the bus. But the practice shed an aspect of secrecy and gained an aspect of public remembering. It no longer felt like something hidden to be guarded jealously. It felt like a habit of attention the town had decided to keep in common. Even so, not everything was resolved. People who favored pragmatic progress worried the plaque was ornamental.
Others were afraid that children would take it as a tale to be molded into games. Memory is a live thing. It requires tending. The town had made a start. That was all anyone could do. Start. Winter thinned into the hollow of March. One morning the heater coughed and the students climbed aboard, still half asleep. I turned the bus out of the depot and caught, in my mirror, the back seat where once he had sat. The apple I had carved months earlier was long gone. In its place sat a small, fresh fruit. Someone, whoever, had taken the ritual up in their private way, had set on the dash. Plain, unmarked, bright as a small sun. I smiled without planning to. The sight of it steadied something in me. We kept a copy of the laminated rules in the depot ledger and a photocopy among the board materials. I left my notebook in the glove compartment, filled with small entries, dates, a note about a retired driver's recollection, Caleb's testimony, a note about Catherine's hands on the plaque.
The ledger was not meant to prove anything supernatural. It was meant to gather evidence that a town had chosen to care in a certain way. You learn in a job like driving that the world is often made of small, patient things. Routes, times, the way a child's backpack sits. Sometimes those small things accumulate into something bigger. The plaque on Route 14 did not change winter into something harmless. People still forgot to double-check jackets. Some nights the wind still cut across township line and made the road look raw. But the town had, in its modest way, decided to name where a child had been lost and to recall the quiet acts that had kept other children safe. A few months after the dedication, I was driving late, a thin rain making the world shine like someone had polished it. The students were mostly quiet. At the corner by Hyatt Road, a figure appeared in the rain. My hands tightened on the wheel in an old, reflexive way. For a moment, I thought my pulse would run faster. He stood there, as he had always stood, small, patient, as if he'd been waiting to see how the town would keep its promises. I did what I had learned to do. I placed the apple again on the dash at the start of the route, just as I had always done. I checked the mirror the way Rule 3 instructed, not holding a gaze longer than a breath. When he met my eyes, just briefly, I said it aloud because it had become a speech the town now performed together. I hope you find your way home. He smiled in that way that had settled me months earlier. Then he did something quieter. He lifted his hand as if returning a salute, then walked off down the road toward the fields. The rain seemed to thin around him. My breath fogged the windshield for a moment, then cleared. The heater purred. The bus, tired and honest as always, rolled on. People ask me sometimes whether the plaques and the apples changed anything. I answer with something like the truth. They didn't repeal loss, and they didn't invent new guarantees. What they did was create a place where memory could live beside civic life. Where before there had been a ledger kept secret and scattered, now there was a public place to look and be reminded of what a town does for its children. That alone matters. On slow nights, I still take my yellow pad and write down the soft things that happen. A freshman who stops to hold his friend's books. A girl who tucks a stray scarf into a seat for somebody who'd left it. A retired driver who adds a quick note about nights he remembers. People send me clippings now, short notices that crop up when the town remembers something buried. Dolores sends menu lists from potlucks she presides over, tiny rituals that stitch a community together. The apple ritual is now as much an offering to memory as it is a habit of attention. Every so often, on the corner by Hyatt Road, someone leaves a small token at the base of the plaque, a child's drawing, a pressed leaf, a note on a napkin. Once, a teenager left a small folded card that simply said, in a shaky hand, "Thanks." Those tokens do what they can. They keep the memory active and remind us we are not only a town of plans and ordinances, but of people who walk home and sometimes need others to notice. I still drive Route 14. I still feel the cold at the back of the bus sometimes, not as fear, but as a reminder of what the town almost lost and what it chose to reclaim. The presence I once called small and haunted has become, for my part, a neighborly thing.
I cannot say why or how, and I won't pretend to offer a better explanation than that. People who look for tidy answers will be disappointed. Those of us who live with the gentle, persistent work of attention are content to do the next small thing. If you ever find your way past Hyatt Road, you'll likely see the little bronze plaque and an apple's brown skin in the grass from some earlier offering. You might think, briefly, about the weight of small acts. You might remember someone who had the discipline to tend a habit until it became a public mercy. Or maybe you'll stand there and say the phrase aloud if the moment calls for it. For me, the route never got easier in any magical sense. The grading on the hills remained the same, winter still bit. But there was a new steadiness to my hands, the kind that comes from doing an office of devotion in common. The apple, the mirror, the phrase, the plaque that now rests on Route 14's depot. When the morning light hits the bronze just so, you can read the letters and feel, oddly and warmly, as if the town has bent to whisper a name and found itself less alone for the effort. Sometimes, as I drive, I think of Eugene Pettit arranging his little notes, of Dolores tapping her pen on the desk, of Catherine's hand on the plaque. I think of Caleb, who now helps kids find their books. I think of the twins and the diffidence in their eyes when the town named what had for years been private. I think of the boy who rode the back seat and of how a small, steady set of practices kept him, in some sense, present enough to be remembered. There are rules we follow on Route 14. They once lived in a laminate sleeve and a driver's glove compartment. They are still there, both instruction and reminder. They are modest and particular. They ask us to practice attention, to keep a small kindness in habitual motion, and to speak a phrase that has become, for us, a town's private benediction. If anyone asks what happened in the end, I say this plainly. We named a corner, we put up a plaque, we accepted the work of remembering as a civic duty. A boy who had been part of a ledger of small rescues was given a place in the town's visible geography. Drivers still place apples on dashes. On nights when the fog comes down, something about the ride back feels less alone. I still keep the notebook on the seat beside me. When the bus is empty and the heater hums, I write small things down. Sometimes I write about weather. Sometimes I write about the look on a father's face when he sees his child wave at the depot. Sometimes I write about the way a phrase loosens itself in my chest until it becomes a prayer of the simplest sort, not magical, only human. I hope you find your way home. I say it still sometimes in the dark between routes, and a small smile answers from the rear seat. Then the bus pulls away from the curb, the fields slip past, and we keep driving, steady as a town that has learned to honor what it can repair. If that is unbelievability to some, then so be it. To me, it is only what you'd expect, people doing the small things that make life bearable for one another.